The research vessel hung in calculated emptiness, equidistant from 3 star systems, far enough from any gravitational well that space felt like a deliberate absence. Kelvin had designed the isolation himself. No planets visible, no background radiation, nothing but the cold mathematics of interstellar void. He had been preparing for this assignment for 2 standard years. Every specialist who had attempted direct study of humanity had returned changed in ways that defied their species' cognitive architecture. The Veskari were a collective consciousness. After 3 months studying humans, the research team had developed boundaries, thoughts that originated in single bodies and stayed there, private and unshared. Within a year, the entire team had undergone voluntary separation from the collective. The Thren case was more dramatic. A hive mind of 14 billion individuals had fractured into philosophical factions after cultural exchange with a human colony. They disagreed about questions the Thren had never thought to ask: whether existence required purpose beyond continuation, whether beauty had value separate from function. Kelvin had spent 3 centuries studying mimetic hazards. He had never failed, not once in 300 years. The methodology was elegant in its caution: complete isolation. All findings transmitted through 7-layer sterilization protocol. If contamination appeared, his neural patterns would be reset to archived baseline. Subject K-1773 had arrived 3 days ago. Marcus Chen, 37, structural engineer. The human had accepted without negotiation, asking 3 questions and saying simply, "When do we start?" Kelvin activated the monitoring systems. Marcus sat on the bed's edge, hands on his knees, looking at nothing. After 17 minutes, he stood and walked through the habitat with professional assessment rather than personal curiosity. The first interview began at the designated time. Marcus appeared exactly on schedule, hands in pockets. "Dr. Kelvin, I assume," he said. "You may call me Kelvin." "Marcus is fine." The human sat. "So, what do you want to know first? Why did you agree?" Marcus was quiet. "Because when I looked at my life from the outside, it looked exactly the way I designed it. And I realized I didn't care about any of it as much as I thought I should. Seemed like a good time to step away." 3 months of observation followed. Marcus established routines: morning exercise, breakfast, mathematics texts, entertainment media, evening meal, precise sleep schedule. He never complained, never showed distress, but also never seemed to experience joy. By month's end, Kelvin had massive data. None explained what made humans dangerous to study. The directorate approved limited physical proximity, full isolation suit, 3-meter minimum distance, 1 hour weekly. The airlock cycled. Marcus looked up from his reading. "That suit looks uncomfortable," he said. "The protection is necessary." "I'm not contagious, not in the way you think." Marcus set the display aside. "You can't catch being human. The precaution is against mimetic contamination. I know what it's for, but you're studying the wrong thing. You keep treating me like a puzzle, but humans aren't puzzles. We're stories. Stories are subjective. Science requires objective measurement. How do you measure what it feels like to be so bored with your own competence that you volunteer to be locked up for 3 years? Kelvin found himself tracking Marcus's hand movements, expressive, unconscious, physical thought made visible. "You believe your species is inherently destabilizing," Kelvin said. "I think we're infectious in the way freedom is infectious. Once you know you can choose something different, it's hard to go back." Marcus met his visual senses. "And that terrifies your civilization. If that analysis is correct, then direct study is genuinely dangerous." "Yeah, but you already knew that. So why are you here?" "Because understanding is the highest value in a cord civilization, even if it changes you into something your civilization won't accept. I have implemented sufficient safety protocols." That's what all the others thought. The human's expression softened. "I think you're not here to study me. I think some part of you is already questioning the perfect system." The statement was so precise that Kelvin checked his biometric sensors. Readings were stable. Just discomfort with how clearly the human had seen something Kelvin hadn't acknowledged. The weekly sessions became the structure around which everything organized. Marcus asked as many questions as he answered. "It's like you're designed not to suffer," Marcus said during the 5th session. Everything that hurts in human psychology, your species engineered solutions for. We have evolved beyond unnecessary suffering. But doesn't that eliminate meaning? If you can't suffer, can you feel joy? Contentment is sufficient. For what? Marcus was looking at him like the question had an answer that mattered. Contentment is the goal, the optimal condition for rational thought. That's where we're different. Humans don't want optimal, we want intense. Marcus picked at the flooring. We'd rather feel everything than feel nothing at all. You experience your own existence as uncertain, Kelvin said. Not uncertain, just not inevitable. I could be living differently. The fact that I'm not means something. Marcus paced. You don't have that, do you? There's no gap between what you decide and what you do. Indecision is inefficient, but that gap is where freedom lives. Kelvin asked, what did you do in that gap when you chose this assignment? Marcus smiled. I sat in my apartment for 6 hours. I could have calculated the optimal choice in 20 minutes. But I sat there thinking about my perfect life. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something that scared me. So you chose fear over comfort. I chose possibility over certainty. Marcus sat closer to the boundary than usual. And yeah, that's probably not rational, but it's human. 3.04 meters, close enough to see breathing variations. You're afraid now, Marcus said. I am following protocols. You're standing in a perfect suit, behind safety distance, following every rule. And you're still afraid. I am uncertain about the outcome. Uncertainty creates discomfort. Welcome to being human. We live here. By the 3rd month of proximity sessions, patterns emerged. Marcus had habits, rituals, tells, microscopic expressions that preceded his words. You're staring, Marcus said during their 14th session. I am observing. You do it a lot now. Like you're trying to figure out something that doesn't fit your categories. Your non-verbal communication carries more information than verbal content. Translation. You're trying to read me. Marcus laughed. How am I doing? Increasingly. You exhibit consistent patterns. Professional topics increase physical tension. Abstract concepts animate you. Personal questions get deflection unless you've decided they're genuine. Marcus was very still now. That's extremely accurate. You are uncomfortable with being understood. I'm uncomfortable with being predictable. The human shifted, breaking eye contact. I came here because my life felt like a script, and now you're telling me I'm just as patterned here. All behavior follows patterns. But if I'm just patterns, what makes me human instead of a complex machine? Kelvin hesitated before delivering the standard answer. You believe you are more than patterns. I want to be, but I don't know if wanting it makes it true. Marcus pulled one knee to his chest. What if there is no gap? What if I'm choosing to feel like I chose? The Accord's position is that subjective experience of choice is sufficient, but you don't believe in free will. The concept is incoherent given our understanding of causality. Then why study it? Why care? I am attempting to understand how a species can function without optimized cognition. That's the research question. But what do you want to understand? Not the Accord. You. The distinction should have been irrelevant, but Marcus was right. I want to know if you experience existence differently than I do. Whether consciousness feels different when it includes suffering and uncertainty. You want to know what it's like to be human. I want to know if being human means something that being Accord doesn't. Marcus held his gaze. Ask me something real, something you actually want to know. Dangerous, but Kelvin asked anyway. Does it feel lonely, being so thoroughly individual? Yes, constantly. Every human is alone inside their own skull, trying to build bridges to other skulls, knowing the bridges are always incomplete. That sounds unbearable. It is. And it's also beautiful. Because when someone understands you even a little bit, it matters more than anything. The human's voice carried grief mixed with hope. The Accord doesn't have that, do you? No. So you've never experienced what it feels like when someone really sees you. The question landed like physical impact. The Accord shared information perfectly, but individual experience was still private. He had always been connected and never been known. Until now. The session ended. The diagnostic showed elevated activity in social processing networks. He spent the rest of the cycle thinking about what it meant to be known. The directorate's response was flagged urgent. His cognitive patterns showed concerning deviations. Additional monitoring would be implemented. If deviations progressed, neural reset would be mandatory. Next session, Marcus took one look at him. They threatened you. Additional monitoring protocols have been implemented because you're showing contamination. What happens if it progresses? Neural reset to archived baseline. They'll erase everything you've experienced here. They will restore optimal cognitive function. Those aren't the same thing. Marcus stayed back, giving space. How do you feel about that? The question assumes personal attachment to current cognition. Bullshit. If you had no attachment, you wouldn't have elevated stress markers every time you enter this room. You are anthropomorphizing my behavior. Then justify this. Why did you ask me if being individual feels lonely? That's not data collection. That's you wanting to understand something about yourself. Marcus responded to honesty. I wanted to know if what I was beginning to experience had a name in human psychology. And what were you experiencing? Disconnection from baseline. The recognition that I'm uncertain whether contamination would constitute loss or growth. Marcus exhaled. Welcome to being human. This is what we do every day. How do you function with constant uncertainty? We make meaning anyway. We choose what to believe even though we know we might be wrong. Marcus approached the boundary slowly. He stopped at exactly 3 meters. The question isn't whether you can function with uncertainty. You already are. The question is whether you're going to let them reset you. The alternative is permanent alteration that will make me incompatible with a cord civilization. The alternative is growth. I don't know if I can finish this study, Kelvin said. I know. Marcus extended his hand across the divide, palm up, but maybe that's not the real question anymore. 3 minutes remained. Kelvin could maintain protocol, return to quarters, file standard report, or close the distance. 2.8 meters, then 2, then 1. Proximity alarms activated. Kelvin disabled them manually. At 0.5 meter, he stopped. I don't know what happens next, Kelvin said. Neither do I. Marcus pressed his palm against the suit's chest plate. But at least we don't know together. The session timer expired. The automated systems recorded the violation. And Kelvin stayed exactly where he was, while the foundations of everything he had been crumbled into everything he was becoming. The response team arrived within 6 hours. Dr. Shenval entered with 3 assistants. Kelvin, the protocol violations are extensive. I am aware. You crossed safety distance, disabled alarms, maintained unauthorized contact 17 minutes beyond termination. She activated a display. Your neurological patterns show significant deviation. Yes. You acknowledge contamination. Kelvin considered carefully. I acknowledge significant cognitive changes. Whether those constitute contamination depends on how you define optimal function. Shenval's expression shifted. That question itself demonstrates contamination. You are questioning fundamental assumptions healthy accord cognition would never examine, or revealing limitations always present. You sound like the Vescari before their separation. She moved closer. We can still restore you. The reset procedure will eliminate contaminated patterns. And eliminate everything I have learned. Eliminate the corruption, yes. Including my understanding of Marcus's experience. My recognition of limitations in our civilization. Those are not understanding. Those are symptoms of infection. She activated assessment equipment. Please submit to scanning. The equipment mapped his neural patterns. When complete, Shenval reviewed results with visible concern. The contamination is extensive. You've developed entirely new neural pathways. Most concerning, you're exhibiting preference formation independent of optimization protocols. Independent preferences are characteristic of human cognition. Exactly. You are developing human thought patterns. You will become incompatible with a cord neural architecture, isolated from shared cognitive networks that define our civilization. I'll become individual. You'll become broken. All of them describe transformation as liberation. But from external perspective, they are clearly damaged. They suffer anxiety, doubt, uncertainty. They make choices contradicting their own objectives. Marcus described something similar, the isolation of individual consciousness. He also said, imperfect connection matters more than perfect isolation. He is contaminating you with irrational frameworks, or teaching me that rationality itself is limited. Shenval was silent. If you refuse intervention, the Directorate will classify you contaminated and remove you from Accord Society. Everything you have contributed, every connection you have maintained, all severed. I understand. And you choose this anyway. I choose to continue learning what this transformation means. There is no continuing. The contamination is progressive. Every additional exposure will deepen the damage. Kelvin thought about Marcus waiting below, about questions they had shared, about recognition of being understood. I refuse intervention, Kelvin said. Shenval's expression showed regret and resignation. Then I am required to implement quarantine protocols. All communication with Accord networks will be severed. Within the hour, Kelvin felt the disconnection, the severing of neural links that had always connected him to collective systems, the sudden absence of constant communion. For the first time in his existence, he was truly alone. The isolation was immediate and total. He experienced what Marcus had tried to explain, the loneliness of individual consciousness. It should have been unbearable, but beneath discomfort, Kelvin experienced something else. These thoughts were his, these feelings belonged to him alone, and in their privacy, they felt more real than 3 centuries of perfect connection. He activated the habitat's communication. The Directorate has implemented quarantine protocols. I am now classified contaminated. Pause. Then Marcus's voice. Are you okay? I am experiencing significant discomfort from isolation, but also something I cannot adequately categorize, a sense that this discomfort is meaningful rather than merely painful. Welcome to the club. That's what it feels like to be human. I don't know how to function this way. Nobody does. We just make it up as we go. Can you still come to the habitat? Kelvin checked access protocols. The Directorate had severed Accord connection but hadn't restricted physical movement. I can still access the habitat. Then come down here. No suit this time. If you're already contaminated, the barriers are pointless. Kelvin walked to the airlock, cycled through without isolation suit for the first time. The inner door opened. Marcus stood waiting, 3 meters away, then 2. Then Marcus crossed the final distance, and Kelvin felt unprotected physical contact for the first time. Warm, immediate, undeniably real. Okay, Marcus said quietly, hand on Kelvin's shoulder. Now we figure out what comes next. And Kelvin found himself thinking that figuring it out together might be enough. Living in the habitat wasn't what Kelvin had anticipated. The morning stretching became shared. There was something meditative about the repetition. You're thinking too hard, Marcus said one morning. It's not supposed to be perfect. I am attempting to execute correctly. You're attempting to optimize it. Marcus shifted position. See, I'm not perfectly balanced, but I'm here, doing it. And that's what matters. They ate breakfast together. Marcus explained concepts like flavor and comfort food that had nothing to do with nutritional optimization. Try this, Marcus said, handing him coffee. The flavor was complex in ways Accord nutrition never bothered with. This serves no optimal function, Kelvin observed. Exactly. It exists purely because people like it. Marcus drank from his cup. Not everything has to be useful to matter. These conversations became their structure. Marcus talked about his hollow career, relationships that never went deep enough. Kelvin talked about Accord civilization, tried to explain constant connection. It sounds peaceful, Marcus said one afternoon, never having to doubt. It was peaceful, but it was also hollow. I didn't recognize the hollowness until I experienced its opposite. What's it like? Having thoughts that belong only to you? Terrifying. Every conclusion I reach, I have to question whether it's true or just contaminated cognition. I have no external baseline. Welcome to human epistemology. Marcus's smile was wry. The best answer we've come up with is to keep questioning and accept that perfect certainty isn't available. One evening, Marcus looked up from reading. Can I ask about Accord relationships? Whether you have something equivalent to friendship. Constant connection provides perfect information sharing, but I'm not certain that constitutes friendship as you describe it. What's missing? Choice. Accord connection is automatic, but you've described friendship as choosing to know someone despite difficulty, and you never had that. I never knew I didn't have it until I experienced it here, with you. Calvin met Marcus's gaze. You choose to know me even though I am alien. That choice means something automatic connection never could. Marcus was quiet. I need to tell you something. I'm developing feelings for you that go beyond friendship. I think about you constantly. I catch myself watching you. He maintained eye contact despite vulnerability. I know this wasn't what either of us intended. Calvin's contaminated cognition supplied recognition immediately. The Accord has no concept for this kind of attachment. What you're describing sounds profoundly non-optimal. It is completely irrational. You're a different species, my research subject. We're trapped together. Zero practical reasons for these feelings. Marcus's smile was self-aware. And yet here we are. Here we are. I find myself restructuring priorities around your well-being. When I process information, I filter it through considerations of what you would think. This is profoundly inefficient, but it feels more important than anything my baseline cognition ever prioritized. That's love. The irrational prioritization of another person's existence. I have no training for this. Nobody does. You just live through it. Calvin moved closer, reducing distance to nothing. Marcus shifted to accommodate. I'm afraid, Calvin said. Not of the feeling, but of my complete lack of framework. You are definitely making mistakes. So am I. Marcus's hand settled on the back of his neck, warm and steady. Is this okay? Yes. Marcus's other hand came up, framing Calvin's face with gentleness. I'm going to kiss you now if that's something you want. I don't have protocols for this. Neither do I. Not with someone like you. We'll figure it out. Marcus leaned forward slowly. The kiss was warm and strange, and unlike anything baseline cognition had prepared him for, not optimal, not efficient, just human and immediate and somehow more real than 3 centuries of perfect function. When they separated, Marcus rested his forehead against his. How was that? Unprecedented, uncomfortable, significant beyond any data. I would like to do it again. Marcus laughed quietly. We can do that. They stayed close, learning the language of physical proximity. What happens to us? Calvin asked eventually. When the 3 years end? The Accord will never accept me back, and you have a life to return to. My old life doesn't exist anymore. The person who lived it doesn't exist. Marcus's hands were still touching him. I've changed as much as you have. And after the contract ends? I don't know, but I know I don't want to lose this. Then we figure out what comes after, Calvin said. Together. Together, Marcus agreed, and kissed him again. 3 weeks after the kiss, a transmission arrived. Not to Calvin, he was isolated from networks. The transmission came to Marcus directly. They're terminating the study early, Marcus said, reading with tension. 6 months remaining, but ending it now. Transport vessel in 3 weeks to return me to human space. 3 weeks. Then Marcus would be gone. Did they provide justification? Compromise of research integrity. Diplomatic for, their researcher went native. Marcus set the display aside. They're honoring compensation. I'll have enough currency to do whatever comes next. You could return to your profession. I could, but that's not what either of us wants. I want you to stay, but I have no framework to offer. I am isolated from Accord civilization. I cannot return to human space. My presence would create the same contamination effects. I exist in permanent liminal state. So we create a third option. I don't understand. Marcus began pacing. The Accord quarantined humanity because contact creates contamination. But what if that's not a bug? What if it's a feature? All those researchers who experienced contamination, they didn't become broken. They became different. What if humans aren't a hazard to be contained but a catalyst for transformation? The Accord would never accept that. The Accord doesn't have to. There are 63 contaminated researchers from 9 species, all isolated. Plus you. Plus however many humans have been affected. What if we brought them together? Created a community of beings who exist between civilizations? Calvin processed the proposal. You're describing something with no precedent. A civilization of contaminated individuals with no shared baseline. Exactly. A community built on translation rather than conformity, where being different is the norm. Marcus moved closer. The Accord wants perfect optimization. Humanity wants absolute freedom. But maybe there's a space between those extremes. That sounds profoundly unstable. It sounds profoundly human, messy and difficult, and probably fail in 100 ways. Marcus took Kailvin's hands. But I'd rather try to build something new with you than go back to perfect systems we've already proven we can't live within. Kailvin wanted to argue unrealistic, but his contaminated cognition recognized something true, the possibility of belonging somewhere, not despite transformations but because of them. We would need to contact other contaminated researchers, determine if they share this vision. Secure resources and location. Kailvin found himself problem-solving rather than rejecting. The logistics are complex. Everything worth doing is complex. Marcus smiled. We have 3 weeks. Let's see what's possible. They sent careful messages. Some responses were immediate. The Veskari individuals seeking others who understood. The Thren philosophers who had fractured from their hive mind. Others were cautious. Several had adapted to isolation, weren't ready to risk another transformation, but enough responded with interest that the theoretical community started to feel possible. 12 researchers confirmed, Marcus reported one evening. Different species, different contamination patterns, but all transformed by contact with humanity. 12 plus us. 14 beings attempting to build society from incompatible foundations. 14 beings who've proven they can learn to think in frameworks other than the ones they were born with. Marcus looked up. That's the skill set we need. The ability to understand multiple perspectives and build bridges. Kailvin moved to sit beside him. I'm afraid this will fail, that we'll discover contamination only works in isolation. It might. Probably will in some ways. Marcus leaned into contact. But staying isolated guarantees loneliness. At least this way we fail together. That's not particularly optimistic. It's human. We try things knowing they might not work, because possibility of connection is worth the risk. Marcus turned to face him. And maybe with you it works. Maybe we build something messy and imperfect and somehow functional. Kailvin kissed him. When they separated, Marcus was smiling. 3 weeks. We leave this vessel and start building something new. You ready? No, but I'm choosing it anyway. That's very human of you. They spent remaining time preparing, gathering resources, coordinating with contaminated researchers, planning logistics. It was complex and probably impossible, and they did it anyway. The night before the transport arrived, they lay together in the sleeping area. Not sleeping, too aware of pending transition. I don't know how to do this, Kailvin said. Build community with contaminated beings, function without protocols, exist in the gap between civilizations. Neither do I. Marcus's hand found his. But I know I want to do it with you. That's enough to start. What if it's not enough? Then we figure out what else we need together. Kailvin considered that. Baseline cognition would have rejected such uncertainty. But his contaminated self understood. Not certainty, but commitment. Not optimization, but presence. I love you, Kailvin said, using the human framework. I don't fully understand what that means, but I know it's true. I love you too, and we'll figure out what it means together. They stayed like that until morning, preparing for a future neither could predict, but both were choosing anyway. The transport vessel docked precisely on schedule. Sarah Chen, Marcus's cousin and ship's captain, introduced herself with practical efficiency. Marcus told me about what you're trying to build. Sounds ambitious. It sounds impossible, Kailvin corrected. We're attempting to create functional community from beings transformed in incompatible ways. So like humanity, but with better excuses for dysfunction. Sarah's tone carried humor. Take care of him, yeah? The journey to rendezvous coordinates took 5 days. Kailvin reviewed files on other contaminated researchers. Each case unique, but patterns emerged. Discovery of individual identity, development of personal values, capacity to question foundations. Marcus worked on practical logistics, habitat construction, resource allocation, governance frameworks. I keep running into the same problem, Marcus said one evening. Every governance model assumes baseline consensus. But we won't have that. Then perhaps governance isn't the correct framework. Perhaps we need something more flexible. Like what? Translation protocols. Instead of assuming consensus, we assume difference and build systems for negotiating between incompatible frameworks. Kelvin pulled up a visualization. Governance as ongoing conversation rather than fixed structure. Marcus studied the visualization. Like jazz. Multiple instruments playing different melodies that somehow create coherent music because they're listening to each other. He played an audio file of complex musical conversation. Kelvin listened. It was chaotic by Accord standards, no perfect synchronization. But there was structure in chaos, meaning in improvisation. Yes, that's what I mean. We build community like jazz. Individual voices in structured dialogue. I love that you naturally gravitated toward using human art as metaphor. Marcus pulled him close. You're more contaminated than you realize. They arrived at coordinates to find vessels already waiting. Over the next cycle, the rest arrived. 12 contaminated researchers from 9 species. The first group meeting was chaotic. Communication required multiple translation layers. Cultural protocols conflicted. Cognitive frameworks collided. But beneath chaos, Kelvin recognized the same pattern he and Marcus had developed. Careful negotiation of difference in service of connection. A Veskari named Treshnik spoke first. I thought isolation was the price of individual awareness, but perhaps we can build new connection that doesn't require surrendering what we've learned. The challenge is that we have all learned different things, said a Thren philosopher. How do we coordinate with no shared baseline? Marcus stepped forward. We don't coordinate through shared baseline, we coordinate through translation. Each of us has learned to think in at least 2 frameworks. That means we all have practice bridging incompatible ways of thinking. The discussion continued for hours. Questions about logistics mixed with philosophical debates. It was messy and complicated. It was also the most hopeful thing Kelvin had experienced since transformation began. They established preliminary protocols, consensus for major decisions, but multiple veto pathways, structured dialogue for conflicts, rotating leadership, explicit acknowledgement that they would make mistakes and adapt. This will fail sometimes, Kelvin said. We will have conflicts we can't resolve, misunderstandings that damage relationships. Probably, Marcus agreed. But we'll also have moments when translation works. When different perspectives create understanding, none of us could reach alone. The contaminated researchers began establishing settlement on a small planet. Not perfect for anyone's biology, but tolerable for everyone with appropriate supports. They built habitats accommodating different needs, created common spaces, established protocols for constant negotiation. Kelvin and Marcus worked side by side, translating between frameworks, building bridges. One evening, watching the settlement take shape, Marcus said, "This is what humanity does naturally. We're always translating between incompatible perspectives. The contamination didn't make me different. It just made me more consciously aware of what being human actually means. And my contamination made me aware of what Accord cognition was designed to avoid, the messy reality of beings who think differently trying to exist together." Kelvin leaned into Marcus's warmth. Perhaps contamination is just becoming conscious of what was always true, but hidden by our civilization's optimization. So we're not damaged, we're just awake. Awake to complexity, to contradiction, to the reality that optimization and authenticity might be incompatible. Kelvin looked at the settlement. "I don't know if this will work, but I know it's worth trying." "That's all we can ever know," Marcus said, and kissed him. 2 years into the settlement's existence, they received communication from the Accord, an encrypted message from Dr. Shenval. "I don't know if you'll receive this, but I need you to understand what's happening in Accord space. The quarantine is failing." Kelvin played the message for the Coordination Council. Shenval continued, "We're seeing contamination patterns in researchers who never had direct human contact, second-generation transmission through documentation, beings who read about human frameworks and begin questioning Accord protocols. It's spreading through scholarly networks." The message included data, infection rates, geographic spread. Contamination was affecting younger researchers most dramatically. The Directorate is implementing stricter information controls, censoring research, quarantining documentation, attempting to stop the spread. But I don't think it will work. Once beings know alternative frameworks exist, they become curious. The message ended unexpectedly. "I may be compromised myself. I've been researching transformation cases, and I find myself questioning assumptions I never examined. If I reach the point where restoration becomes necessary, I'm not certain I'll accept it. The council discussion was intense. Some saw spreading transformation as validation, others worried about destabilization. This is what the Accord feared, Kelvin said. Cascade failure, transformation spreading faster than civilizational structures can adapt. Is that a bad thing? Treshnik asked. Maybe what emerges is healthier. Or maybe chaos. Billions of beings suddenly questioning everything with no frameworks to replace what they're discarding. Marcus studied data. They'll be isolated, confused, potentially desperate. We need to offer them something, another researcher said. A model for how transformation can lead to functional community. The discussion generated consensus. Open communication with contaminated Accord researchers, offering the settlement as example and resource. Kelvin drafted the message, drawing on every translation skill he had developed. To those experiencing unexpected changes after exposure to human frameworks, you are not broken, you are transforming. This will be difficult. Your baseline protocols will interpret it as corruption. But correction is not the only option. Community with other transformed beings is possible. He included documentation of the settlement, coordination protocols accommodating incompatible frameworks, governance structures balancing collective needs with individual autonomy. We are proof that contamination is not inevitably destructive. We are beings from 9 species, all transformed, building functional community through translation rather than conformity. If you are experiencing changes your civilization cannot accommodate, you have alternatives. Join us, learn with us, become consciously contaminated. They sent the message through channels Shenval provided. Within days, responses began arriving. Confused researchers describing cognitive changes, isolated beings who had accepted quarantine, younger Accord members unable to return to unquestioning optimization. The settlement established mentorship protocols. Kelvin spent hours in communication with Accord researchers, translating their experiences. It's like you're teaching them to be bilingual in cognition, Marcus observed, helping them maintain Accord analysis while incorporating human reasoning. That's exactly what translation is. Not replacing one framework, but learning to think in multiple simultaneously. Some adapted rapidly. Others struggled with holding incompatible truths. Some accepted neural reset. Others existed in chronic cognitive dissonance, stuck between frameworks. You can't save everyone, Marcus said after a difficult case. Some beings aren't ready for this kind of change. But if contamination keeps spreading, more beings will be forced into transformation, whether ready or not. We need better support. We need the Accord to acknowledge that contamination isn't corruption. That transformation requires accommodation rather than suppression. Marcus pulled up latest data. But they're doubling down on containment, more censorship, more quarantine, more pressure for reset. The Accord was treating contamination like infection, requiring cure rather than change requiring adaptation. We need to change the narrative, Kelvin said. Stop letting the Accord define contamination as damage. Start articulating transformation as legitimate alternative. That's basically declaring ideological war on the most stable civilization in the galaxy. It's declaring that beings have the right to choose transformation even when it contradicts collective optimization. The Accord will see that as war, but for contaminated beings it's survival. They developed a framework, careful articulation of translation as valid cognitive mode, drawing on settlement examples, demonstrating how beings could function effectively while thinking in multiple frameworks. This is going to make things harder, Marcus warned. The Accord mostly ignores us now. This will force response. Contamination is spreading whether we articulate it or not. Better to provide framework that validates transformation than let the Accord's corruption narrative be the only interpretation. They published the framework. Response was immediate and polarized. Some embraced it eagerly, others rejected it. The Accord's official response? Condemnation, increased censorship, formal classification of the settlement as hostile memetic source. But beneath official rejection, Kelvin noticed something in data. More researchers questioning, more beings choosing adaptation over reset, more acceptance that transformation was real and asking how to manage it functionally. The narrative was shifting. Slowly, imperfectly but unmistakably. "We're winning," Marcus said. "We're surviving. The Accord hasn't fallen, but we've created space for translation to exist alongside optimization. That's enough." Marcus kissed him. "You've changed so much from the researcher who first stepped into my habitat. I didn't know opposition was possible, or that I was allowed to choose values that contradicted optimization. You taught me that consciousness includes capacity to choose what matters. And what do you value? This, you, the community we're building, the contaminated beings we're helping. I value authentic existence over optimized function. That's the choice contamination enables. That's the choice humanity offers, the possibility that you're allowed to decide who you want to become." And Calvin found himself thinking that maybe the Accord had been right to fear humanity. Not because humans were dangerous, but because they offered something more terrifying. Genuine freedom to choose transformation over stability, growth over optimization, authenticity over perfect function. That was the real mimetic hazard. Not corruption, but liberation. And once beings knew liberation was possible, no amount of quarantine could contain it. 4 years into the settlement's existence, a vessel appeared in orbit without prior communication. Not human design, not Accord. Something else entirely. The Coordination Council gathered in the observation dome as the vessel descended. It was elegant in ways neither human nor Accord engineering achieved. Organic curves suggesting biological growth rather than construction. "Unidentified vessel, please state your origin and purpose," Marcus transmitted on open channels. The response came in flawless Accord standard language. "This is Dr. Shenval, formerly of the Accord Directorate. I am requesting asylum and permission to join your settlement." Calvin felt something shift in his chest, the human response Marcus had taught him to recognize as hope mixed with concern. "Shenval, you are welcome here, but I need to understand. Are you contaminated? Or is this a Directorate operation?" A pause, then, "I am uncertain what I am. I have been studying transformation for 4 years. I have refused neural reset 3 times. The Directorate has classified me as compromised but not yet fully contaminated. I exist in what your frameworks would call the gap, and I can no longer function in that gap alone." The vessel landed. The airlock cycled. Shenval emerged, and Calvin saw immediately that his former colleague had changed. The precise posture of Accord conditioning was still there, but beneath it was something new. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of individual consciousness. "Calvin," Shenval stopped at a respectful distance. "You were right, contamination is not corruption. Or if it is, then corruption might be preferable to the alternative. What happened?" "I spent 4 years trying to develop containment protocols for transformation. I interviewed every contaminated researcher I could access. I analyzed your settlement's data. I built models attempting to predict and prevent cognitive changes." Shenval's posture shifted, a micro-movement that Accord training would never permit. "And in the process of trying to understand contamination from the outside, I experienced it from the inside. I began to question whether containment was the appropriate goal, whether transformation might be valid rather than merely dangerous, whether individual choice might matter more than collective optimization. And the Directorate's response? They offered me neural reset, return to baseline, resume my position, continue my research from a safe cognitive distance." Shenval met Calvin's eyes, that direct human gaze that Accord conditioning avoided. "I refused. Because even in the uncertainty, even in the discomfort of holding incompatible truths simultaneously, I recognized something more true than anything I had experienced in 5 centuries of perfect function. I recognized that I wanted to choose rather than be optimized, that I valued authentic uncertainty over imposed certainty." Marcus stepped forward. "You understand what you're asking for? This settlement isn't Accord space. We don't have perfect coordination. We don't have optimized solutions. We exist in permanent translation between incompatible frameworks. It's messy and difficult and sometimes painful. I understand, and I choose it anyway." Shenval's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, imperfect, uncertain, completely genuine. "Calvin taught me that choice is possible. You taught the galaxy that transformation can lead to functional community. Now I want to learn what it means to exist authentically, rather than optimally. The council convened briefly. The decision was unanimous. Shenval would be welcomed, mentored through the transition, integrated into the community. Over the following weeks, Kelvin watched his former colleague experience what he had experienced. The disorientation of individual consciousness, the terror of thoughts that belonged to no collective, the slow recognition that isolation could be chosen rather than imposed. "It's harder than I anticipated," Shenval said one evening. They were in the common area, Shenval learning the settlement's informal social protocols. "The accord conditioning is deeply embedded. Every time I make a choice based on personal preference rather than optimization, part of my cognition flags it as error requiring correction. That never fully goes away," Kelvin said. "I still experience it 4 years later, but it becomes quieter, and you learn to recognize it as baseline programming rather than truth." "How do you distinguish between baseline programming and actual truth?" "I test it against experience. If my baseline tells me that personal attachment is inefficient, but my experience shows that connection with Marcus makes my existence more meaningful, I trust the experience." Kelvin paused. "That's what human epistemology teaches. Truth is provisional, tested against reality rather than derived from first principles." Shenval was quiet for a long moment. "The Accord would classify that as cognitive corruption. The Accord classifies anything that contradicts collective optimization as corruption. But what if the corruption is in the system that cannot accommodate individual truth? Then everything I spent 5 centuries building was constructed on a flawed foundation. Not flawed, limited. The Accord achieved genuine good, stability, prevention of suffering, coordination at scale. But it achieved those things by optimizing away individual autonomy. When you recognize that autonomy matters, you can't unknow it. I don't want to unknow it." Shenval's tone carried certainty. "Even in the uncertainty, even in the discomfort, this feels more real than 5 centuries of perfect function." Kelvin understood. It was the same recognition he had experienced in the habitat with Marcus, the moment when contamination stopped being corruption and became liberation. "Welcome to the settlement," Kelvin said. "Welcome to conscious contamination." And Shenval, formerly of the Accord Directorate, now existing in the gap between civilizations, smiled that imperfect human smile that meant authentic feeling rather than social performance. The transformation was continuing, spreading, one being at a time, choosing growth over stability, authenticity over optimization, conscious contamination over imposed perfection. And Kelvin, watching it happen, found himself thinking that maybe this was what the galaxy needed. Not perfect civilizations, but beings willing to question perfection and build something messier, more complicated, and infinitely more true. 6 months after Shenval's arrival, the Accord sent an official delegation, not encrypted, not hidden, a formal diplomatic vessel requesting permission to dock. The Coordination Council gathered. Kelvin felt the old anxiety resurface. 4 years removed from Accord space, and still the conditioning ran deep. "This could be genuine diplomacy," Treshnik suggested. "The spreading contamination might have forced them to consider accommodation." "Or it's a more sophisticated containment strategy," Marcus countered. "Get close enough to study our protocols, then develop better methods for suppression." "We respond as we respond to all contaminated beings," Kelvin said, "with openness and invitation to translate. If they're here in good faith, we engage authentically. If they're here to contain us, we demonstrate that containment is no longer possible." The delegation landed. 3 Accord officials emerged, led by someone Kelvin recognized. Director Veshmar, the senior coordinator who had authorized his original research assignment. "Dr. Kelvin, thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Director, I am surprised the Accord is willing to engage with contaminated beings directly. The situation has evolved beyond our initial containment parameters." Veshmar's tone was carefully neutral, but Kelvin noticed micro-expressions suggesting stress. "Contamination is no longer isolated to individual researchers. We're seeing cascade effects across multiple populations. Traditional protocols are proving insufficient." They convened in the settlement's largest common space. The Accord delegation sat on one side, the settlement's council on the other. The physical arrangement felt symbolic. two civilizations attempting negotiation across fundamental incompatibility. The Directorate acknowledges, Veshmar began, that our understanding of human-influenced cognitive transformation was incomplete. We classified it as mimetic hazard requiring containment. We implemented quarantine protocols designed to prevent spread. These approaches have failed. Because transformation cannot be contained through isolation, Kelvin said. Once beings recognize that choice is possible, no amount of censorship can eliminate that recognition. Precisely. Which brings us to why we are here. Veshmar activated a holographic display showing contamination spread patterns. We are seeking consultation on protocols for managing transformation in ways that preserve individual function while minimizing collective disruption. Your settlement has achieved coordination among contaminated individuals that our models predicted was impossible. We need to understand how. Marcus leaned forward. You're asking us to help you develop better containment strategies. We are asking you to help us develop accommodation strategies. Containment has failed. We require frameworks for allowing transformation while maintaining civilizational stability. The distinction was significant. Kelvin studied Veshmar carefully, looking for signs of deception. But the stress markers were genuine. The Accord was experiencing genuine crisis. What you're describing, Kelvin said carefully, requires fundamental reconceptualization of what stability means. The Accord defines stability as perfect consensus, optimized coordination, elimination of individual variance, but transformation introduces permanent variance. You cannot accommodate transformation while maintaining that definition of stability. Then, what alternative do you propose? Stability through translation rather than conformity. Coordination protocols that assume difference and negotiate between incompatible frameworks rather than eliminating difference through optimization. Kelvin pulled up the settlement's governance structures. We achieve stability not by making everyone think the same way, but by teaching everyone to translate between multiple ways of thinking. Veshmar studied the protocols. This requires every individual to maintain multiple cognitive frameworks simultaneously. That level of cognitive complexity would be overwhelming for baseline Accord consciousness, which is why accommodation requires education, not just policy adjustment. Beings need to learn translation as a skill. It's difficult, many will struggle, some will fail and require support. But it's possible. Kelvin gestured to the settlement around them. We are proof it's possible. The negotiation continued for hours. The Accord delegation asked precise questions about implementation, stress-tested frameworks against scenarios where collective coordination was essential, probed for limitations. What about beings who cannot develop translation capacity? Veshmar asked. Who experience transformation but cannot maintain functional cognition in the gap between frameworks? We provide support structures, mentorship from experienced translated beings. Communities where the gap is normalized rather than pathologized. Time and patience for the transition. Marcus spoke from experience. Some beings will still struggle, but struggling with transformation is different from experiencing it as pure corruption. When you have community that validates your experience, the struggle becomes manageable. And beings who refuse transformation entirely, who prefer baseline optimization to individual choice, they're allowed to remain baseline. Translation is about accommodation, not forced conversion. Some beings will choose collective optimization over individual autonomy. That choice is valid. Kelvin paused. The difference is that it becomes a choice rather than the only option. Veshmar was quiet for a long moment. When they spoke again, their tone had shifted. Less formal, more personal. I must confess something. This delegation is not purely diplomatic. I am experiencing early-stage contamination myself. The Directorate does not know. I volunteered for this assignment because I needed to see whether functional community in the gap was genuinely possible or merely an anomaly you have achieved through unique circumstances. The admission created visible shift in the room's energy. Kelvin recognized it, the moment when formal negotiation became authentic encounter. What have you concluded? Kelvin asked. That it is possible. Difficult, messy, requiring constant effort, but possible. Veshmar met his eyes. And that the effort might be worthwhile, even necessary. The Directorate will not accept that conclusion. No. but enough contaminated beings within accord space will. We are approaching critical mass, the point where transformation is common enough that accommodation becomes more practical than suppression. Your settlement demonstrated the path. Now we need to scale it. The meeting concluded with preliminary agreement. The accord would establish formal translation zones, communities where contaminated beings could coordinate with each other and with baseline accord through structured protocols. The settlement would provide training and consultation. Transformation would be acknowledged as real rather than merely damage. It wasn't perfect, wasn't full acceptance, but it was movement. After the accord delegation departed, Marcus found Kelvin in their habitat. That was unexpected, Marcus said. The accord is adapting, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Kelvin pulled Marcus close. 4 years ago, they would have responded to spreading contamination with military containment. Now they're requesting consultation on accommodation. That's significant change, driven by desperation rather than genuine philosophical shift. Perhaps, but pragmatic accommodation can become genuine acceptance over time. They're learning what we learned, that transformation cannot be contained, only accommodated. That's progress. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about going back? To accord space, I mean, now that they're establishing translation zones. Kelvin considered the question honestly. No, the settlement is home now. This community of contaminated beings, choosing growth over stability, authenticity over optimization. This is where I belong. Not because accord space rejected me, but because I choose to be here. That's very human of you. I'm very contaminated. Marcus kissed him. I love you. For choosing this. For choosing me. For choosing to become, rather than just to be. I love you for teaching me that choice was possible, that I was allowed to question foundations and survive the questioning. That transformation could lead somewhere true. They stayed close, aware of the settlement around them continuing to grow, continuing to prove that contamination could be functional, that translation could be civilization, that beings who thought differently could exist together. And Kelvin found himself thinking that this, the messy, difficult, beautiful reality of chosen connection, was worth every moment of discomfort, every loss of certainty, every risk of the transformation. 5 years after the settlement's founding, Kelvin stood in the coordination chamber, watching a presentation from the Accord's translation zones. The pilot programs had expanded to 17 systems. Thousands of contaminated beings now lived in communities designed for translation rather than optimization. The data was remarkable. Not perfect. Conflicts emerged regularly. Some beings struggled chronically with the gap between frameworks. Efficiency metrics were significantly lower than baseline Accord systems. But functionality was real. Communities were stable. Beings were adapting. The critical insight, reported the zone coordinator via holographic transmission, is that translation requires teaching cognitive flexibility as foundational skill rather than advanced technique. We are implementing education protocols beginning at early development stages, teaching young beings to think in multiple frameworks before baseline optimization patterns become too deeply embedded. Kelvin felt something shift, recognition that this was no longer experimental. The Accord was integrating translation into their civilization's core architecture. Questions? The coordinator asked. Marcus spoke first. What about resistance? Baseline Accord who see translation as corruption of optimal function? Significant and ongoing. Approximately 30% of baseline population actively resists translation education. They advocate for return to pure optimization protocols, stricter contamination containment. The coordinator paused. But approximately 40% have embraced translation as valuable capacity. The remaining 30% are uncertain but willing to experiment. The balance is shifting toward acceptance. The presentation continued with implementation details, challenges, success metrics. When it concluded, the council discussed implications. The Accord is transforming, Treshnik observed. Not as rapidly as contaminated individuals, but systematically. In 2 generations, translation might be baseline rather than aberration. Which raises questions about the settlement's purpose, another researcher said. If the Accord accommodates translation, do contaminated beings still require separate community? The question created uncomfortable silence. The settlement had been founded as refuge for beings who couldn't function in their original civilizations. If those civilizations were adapting, "I think our purpose evolves," Kaelvin said carefully. "We're no longer just refuge. We're laboratory for advanced translation protocols. We're proof of concept for full integration. We're training ground for beings who will teach translation in their original civilizations." He paused. "And we're home for beings who choose translation community over accommodated existence in baseline systems." "You think some will choose to stay even when return becomes possible?" Marcus asked. "I think some of us have transformed beyond the point where return is desirable, even if possible. We're not Accord who learned human thinking. We're not humans who studied Accord protocols. We're something else, beings who exist primarily in translation itself." Kaelvin looked around the chamber at the diverse species represented. "That's not lesser, it's different, and difference has its own value." The discussion continued, but Kaelvin found his attention drifting to larger implications. 5 years ago, he had stood in a research vessel convinced that contamination was corruption requiring containment. Now contamination was transforming civilizations, translation was becoming normal, and the gap between frameworks was being recognized as creative space rather than damage. Everything had changed, including him. That evening, he found Marcus in their habitat, reviewing data from the Accord's education programs. "Can I ask you something?" Kaelvin said. "Always. Do you regret it? Volunteering for the study? Experiencing contamination in reverse? Choosing to build this settlement instead of returning to human space?" Marcus looked up from his work. "Why are you asking?" "Because the Accord is changing. Translation zones are functioning. Return is becoming possible for contaminated beings. I want to know if you would choose differently if you could make the choice again." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he set aside his work and pulled Kaelvin close. "I volunteered for that study because my life felt empty, despite being successful. I was competent and bored and desperately seeking something that felt meaningful." He met Kaelvin's eyes. "I found meaning. Not in the study or the isolation or the theoretical concept of contamination. In you, in this community, in learning that transformation is ongoing choice rather than single decision." "That's not an answer to the question." "Yes, it is. Would I choose differently? No. Because every choice I've made since meeting you has been toward growth rather than comfort, authenticity rather than optimization, conscious contamination rather than imposed perfection. I don't regret any of it. Not the difficulty, not the uncertainty, not the permanent exile from my original context. Even though you age and I don't, even though your biology ensures you'll die while I continue?" Marcus smiled gently. "Even though? Mortality doesn't diminish meaning. If anything, it intensifies it. Every moment matters more because there are finite moments. Every choice is more significant because there are limited choices remaining." Kaelvin pulled him closer. "I don't know how to face your eventual death. Neither do I, but we'll figure it out when it comes, just like we've figured out everything else." Marcus kissed him softly. "That's what love is, remember? Irrational prioritization of another person's existence. It's not rational that I love you. It's not optimal that you love me, but it's true anyway. I wish the Accord had frameworks for this kind of attachment, something in baseline cognition that prepared me for caring about someone this much. If the Accord had those frameworks, you wouldn't have needed contamination to access them, and we wouldn't have met." Marcus rested his forehead against Kaelvin's. "I'll take the contamination and the meeting over the theoretical perfect life where neither was necessary." They stayed like that, close and warm and present with each other. Outside their habitat, the settlement continued its work, teaching translation, supporting contaminated beings, proving that difference could be foundation rather than obstacle. And Kaelvin found himself thinking that maybe this was what civilization should be. Not perfect, not optimized. Just beings choosing to exist together despite incompatibility, building meaning through translation, creating home in the gap between certainties. It was profoundly inefficient, completely non-optimal, and somehow the most true thing he had ever experienced. 10 years after the settlement's founding, Kaelvin stood on the observation deck watching ships arrive and depart. What had begun as 14 contaminated beings choosing exile had grown into a community of 200, with another 1,000 in transition through the Accord's translation zones. The settlement had evolved beyond refuge. It was hub now, educational center, research institution, diplomatic nexus where different civilizations negotiated through translation rather than conflict. Beings came to learn, to teach, to experience what functional community in the gap looked like. Marcus stood beside him, older now. 10 years showed visibly on human biology, lines around his eyes, grey in his hair, the subtle shift in posture that came with aging. Kael'vin looked exactly as he had a decade ago, would look this way for centuries while Marcus aged and eventually died. They didn't talk about it often, but it was always present, the fundamental incompatibility in their biology. "Big day tomorrow," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence. Tomorrow the Accord would formally recognize the settlement as independent diplomatic entity. Translation zones would become permanent rather than experimental. Contamination would be reclassified from mimetic hazard to cognitive diversity. It was victory, everything they had worked toward for 10 years. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. "I don't know. This began as survival strategy, building community because we had no other options. Now it's becoming institutional, official, recognized by the civilizations that rejected us. Is that bad? It's complicated. Recognition means validation, but it also means we're no longer outsiders choosing alternative. We're becoming part of the system, just a different part." Marcus considered that. Maybe that's what success looks like. Not staying permanently outside, but transforming the system enough that it can accommodate what was previously unacceptable. We didn't stop being contaminated, but we made contamination acceptable. You think that's enough? I think that's significant. The Accord didn't fall, humanity didn't change, but the relationship between them evolved. Translation became possible. That's not small achievement. Kael'vin pulled Marcus closer, aware of his warmth, his breathing, the finite nature of his presence. "I've been thinking about what happens after you die." "That's cheerful. I'm serious. You'll age and die within a few decades. I'll continue for centuries. I need to think about what that means." Marcus turned to face him fully. "It means you'll grieve. It means you'll remember. It means this time we have together will matter more because it's finite rather than infinite." He took Kael'vin's hands. "But it doesn't mean you stop growing. You'll continue learning, continue translating, continue choosing transformation over stability. You'll find new meanings, build new connections. That's what contamination taught us. We're always becoming rather than fixed in what we are. I don't want to become without you. You won't be without me. I'll be part of what you've become. Every choice you make after I'm gone will be influenced by what we built together." Marcus smiled. "That's what love does. It changes you permanently. Even after the person is gone, the change remains." "That's very human." "It is. And you're human enough now to understand it." They stood together, watching the settlement's lights, the ships arriving and departing, the community they had helped build, continuing to grow. "I want to tell you something," Kael'vin said. "Something I've been thinking about for months." "I'm listening." "When I first stepped into your habitat 10 years ago, I believed I was studying a phenomenon. I was wrong. I wasn't studying anything. I was encountering someone. And that encounter transformed me in ways no amount of research could have achieved. I know you've told me this before. Let me finish. The transformation wasn't corruption. It was awakening, learning that I could choose what mattered to me, that I was allowed to question foundations, that authentic existence might be more valuable than optimized function. But the real transformation, the one that mattered most, was learning that connection with another being could be more true than any optimization." Kael'vin pulled Marcus closer. "I love you, not because it's rational or optimal, or because Accord protocols suggest this attachment serves collective function. I love you because you taught me that I was allowed to choose what mattered. And you matter more than anything my baseline cognition ever valued." Marcus's eyes were bright with tears. "I love you too, for choosing transformation, for choosing me, for choosing to become instead of just to be. I don't know what I'll become after you die, but I know it will be shaped by what we built together. And that's enough. That's everything," Marcus said, and kissed him. Around them, the settlement continued its work. Contaminated beings learning to translate. Civilizations learning to accommodate difference. The slow transformation of the galaxy's understanding of what consciousness could be. The next morning, the Accord's formal recognition ceremony occurred. Director Veshmar, now fully contaminated and serving as liaison between translation zones and baseline systems, delivered the official statement. The Accord acknowledges that cognitive diversity, including what was previously classified as human-influenced contamination, constitutes valid alternative to baseline optimization. We establish formal diplomatic recognition of the translation settlement and commit to ongoing development of accommodation protocols throughout Accord space. It was bureaucratic language, careful and formal, but beneath the formality was genuine transformation. The settlement celebrated quietly. No grand ceremony, no dramatic declaration, just beings who had chosen growth over stability, authenticity over optimization, acknowledging that their choice had become legitimate rather than merely aberrant. That evening, Calvin and Marcus returned to their habitat, sat together in the familiar space they had shared for 10 years. "We did it," Marcus said quietly. "We survived, and in surviving, we transformed what survival meant." Calvin leaned into Marcus's warmth. "Not just for us, for everyone who comes after. That's what contamination does. It spreads, it transforms. It makes what seemed impossible become inevitable. Do you think it's contagious enough? That the transformation will continue after we're gone? I think we proved it's possible. That's the real contamination, the knowledge that choice exists, that transformation is valid, that beings can exist authentically rather than just optimally. Once beings know that, they can't unknow it. It spreads through knowledge itself." They sat in comfortable silence, aware of each other, aware of the community around them, aware that what they had built would continue long after they were gone. Calvin had been designed for optimal function, trained for perfect analysis, created to serve collective coordination without individual deviation. He had become something entirely different, a contaminated being who chose authenticity over optimization, transformation over stability, love over perfect function. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Looking at Marcus, at the settlement, at the future they were building through conscious contamination, Calvin found himself thinking that maybe the Accord had been right all along. Humanity was dangerous. Their frameworks were infectious. Their values destabilized perfect optimization. But maybe the galaxy needed that danger, needed beings willing to question foundations, to choose growth over certainty, to build meaning from translation rather than conformity. Maybe contamination wasn't corruption at all. Maybe it was just consciousness becoming aware of its own capacity for choice. And if that was contagious, maybe the infection was worth spreading, not because it was better than optimization in any absolute sense, but because it was true, because it honored the reality that beings could choose what they valued, could become rather than just be, could find meaning in the gap between certainties rather than only in perfect function. "Thank you," Calvin said quietly. "For what?" "For contaminating me, for teaching me to question, for showing me that transformation could lead somewhere true." Marcus smiled. "Thank you for choosing to be contaminated, for refusing the reset, for building this with me." "Always," Calvin said, "for as long as we have." "For as long as we have," Marcus agreed. And they sat together as evening settled over the settlement, two contaminated beings who had chosen growth over stability, authenticity over optimization, love over perfect function, choosing, still choosing, always choosing, to become